Right, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Welcome to the Housing Decision Meeting. My name is Councillor Darren Sanders. I'm the Cabinet Member for Housing. Before I begin, I have to provide some health and safety information, so if you're watching online, please bear with us. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the Portsmouth Cultural Trust fire marshal regulations, because we're in a building owned by the Trust, anyone who signed in at the reception desk on the ground floor should please sign out when leaving the building after today's meeting. If you haven't, you don't. Live web streaming apparently is next on this list of things I've been given. So I have to draw everyone's attention to the fact this meeting is being filmed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of this room, and the recording will be on the Council's website for you to download at your pleasure. The camera will mainly capture the backs of anyone making deputations, but I don't see anybody likely to, so your backs will not be captured. But there will be some footage of them as they approach and leave the table where the microphones are located, and of people entering or leaving the room whilst the meeting is in progress, and we will have at least one person who'll come to in a second or two. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting, and I'm delighted that Fiona from the news is here to do just that, on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly that they do not wish to be recorded. Finally, please can everyone remember to use the microphones provided when they are speaking. So that is the formal business started. So I'll start this meeting by going for apologies for absence. Joanne? Oh, sorry, no, I have to introduce everyone for the millions of people who are watching on our live stream. So please, Joanne, just say who you are and what you do.
Joanne Miles-Smith from Democratic Services doing the minutes today.
James Hill, Director of Housing, Neighbourhood and Building Services.
Wayne Layton, Finance Manager.
Danny Lake, Accommodation Manager.
Sharon George, Interim Head of Housing Needs Advice and Support.
Mark Veitch, Head of Local Authority Housing.
Paul Fielding, Assistant Director Housing.
Mark Sage, Tackling Poverty Coordinator.
Maria Cole, Residents Consortium.
Councillor Cal Corkery, Opposition Spokesperson for Housing.
And as you may see, we have another person who has entered the room and needs a chair shifted. Thank you very much, Cal, as you're nearer to him than I am. That's great. So I'm just on the instructions of yelling who you say you are, but you're clearly knackered, having done the journey up the stairs in that chair. So I'll come back to you in a second. So Joe, do we have any apologies for absence at all?
Yes, Councillor Scott Pater Harris is on his way, one of your opposition spokespeople, and he'll be joining the meeting in about 20 minutes or so. Okay.
Now, I also understand from Joanne that Scott has asked that I vary the agenda so he can be here for the private rented sector paper. Now, I'm happy with that because we need to be as open as we can about it. Cal, is that all right with you?
Yep, no problem.
Excellent. If we start before he arrives, we start before he arrives, but somehow I suspect we won't. So the next bit is declarations of interest. Does anybody have anything interesting to declare? I'm mainly looking at Cal there, so just in case. No, lovely. Now, my friend, now you can say who you are. So that's Peter Burton, CLG member. I have to ask that everybody uses the microphone, so just press, I think it's the red button that you've got on there, and you can do that again when you're talking. Lovely. I'm glad rehearsals worked. Okay, that's excellent. So let's go on to the temporary accommodation placement policy. Mr. Fielding, I understand.
Thank you. The purpose of this report is to present our temporary accommodation placement policy, which outlines how the Council will allocate and prioritise temporary accommodation for homeless applicants in priority need. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of information from the report. My colleagues Sharon and Danny here for answering any specific questions which may arise. So the Council recognises the vital role that housing plays in helping residents achieve and maintain the life they want to lead, and also that there are times when crisis situations happen for various reasons which can lead to residents being without a home. This time, the council may have a duty to provide support to help people getting back into a stable home. Although the council does own and lease a number of properties, it's always going to be necessary for us to prioritise resources available to it by allocating temporary accommodation proportionately and as this is formalised within the proposed policy. The council has previously undertaken this role in this regard without a formalised policy. Having a temporary accommodation placement policy isn't a legal requirement, but it was a recommendation from the UK Supreme Court. By creating and publishing this policy, we plan to demonstrate how our commitment to fair and legal allocation of temporary accommodation. It helps our customers who use the service with clarity about the role it undertakes and sets out the factors which were considered when allocating temporary accommodation. So the policy is as an appendix to the main report, and I'll just pick out a few key elements. So in terms of legislative requirements, the policy complies with a range of national legislation, and it is our responsibility as the council and officers to be mindful of it when making relevant decisions. And key pieces of legislation is the Housing Act 1996, particularly sections 188 and 193, which relate to the various duties, duties when somebody is maybe homeless. In terms of offer of temporary accommodation, in identifying a suitable offer, the household's individual circumstances will be considered, and that's taken into account in section 5 of the policy. Regarding types of accommodation that we have, Council has a range of different types of accommodation which are designed to cover the range of customers and likely length of occupation and overall numbers in need at that time. This means that some accommodation is provided by the council, while others might be provided by external providers. And the types of accommodation are identified in section 4.4.1 of the report. All temporary accommodation secured by the council will be subject to fitness checks, and that includes our checks around the condition and safety of the accommodation and suitability of the landlord. And assessments of suitability of temporary accommodation are based upon the individual circumstances relating to their application and those in the household. And the details are set out within the policy. So the recommendations of the report is we ask that the Cabinet member recognises the important role that temporary accommodation has in supporting people in crisis as a result of homelessness. We recognise that this policy formalises the working practice and ensures that fair allocation of temporary accommodation meets our legal obligations. And finally, that we ask that you approve this placement policy, which will then be published on the Council's website. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fielding. Now, just so people know, what I will do is I will ask firstly Pete, and then Maria, and then Cal, and when we get later on the meeting, Scott, when he arrives, for their questions and comments relating to this report, if they have any. If they have none, that's absolutely fine. But Peter, and please switch your microphone on. You're Mr. Happy, are you? Oh, we like Mr. Happy. This is good. This is good. This is good. This is good. Maria?
Yes. On section 3.3, you mentioned the number of households which included dependent children. Do you know exactly how many children and also what the ages of those children were?
Mr. Fielding?
I'll ask
Or
Danny
someone.
I'll ask Danny to answer.
I don't know the exact number of children. I do have that data, but not to hand. What I do know is the number of families that have dependent children currently in our temporary accommodation. I can give you that figure if it helps.
We have that figure in the report, don't we? The number of families with children. I just wondered how many children were actually involved in the temporary placements.
I'm afraid I don't have that figure to hand. It does range generally, but I think the average is 2 children per household if you took an average across all of them. So some only have 1, some have more.
So, to the carry-on bit then, do you know what the ages of those children?
Not specifically, although it ranges in age from very far under 1 right the way through up to 18.
Was that it, Maria, or was there anything else, Mel?
Yeah, moving on then to 4.25, I think it is. I'm pleased to know about the need for safeguarding of children. I'm particularly concerned with children of parents or parent who have to move because of abusive contact, and worried about schooling issues for children. I know that further on in the report some of those are more or less answered, but I'd just like a little bit more about that.
Certainly. We need to admit it's difficult because we have a limited amount of temporary accommodation to always be able to put a family in very, very close proximity to the school, but it's something that we take into account with every placement. We record where the children go to school, and then even if the initial placement is going to create some difficulty, then we try to assist them with travel or work with the education department, and we will look to try to move that family closer if we can at a later date if we can't do it immediately. So we do definitely take it into consideration.
And my last point was 4.3.2. The council consider reasons given for if there's refusals and things like that. Is it just the council that considers the applicants, or do they have a multi-agency thing going on, so that they're talking to people like schools, social workers, whatever, doctors, whatever?
That's a good question. There's some people have a legal right to review of temporary accommodation if they refused it and we said we weren't doing offering anything further. Those are the people that we're accommodating whilst they wait for permanent accommodation. Those who are accommodating whilst we carry out inquiries, they don't have that same legal right to review, but that doesn't mean that we take those decisions lightly. We will understand the circumstances that led to that refusal or the problems in that accommodation. We'll always try to take a proportionate view, trying to understand who's in the household, what the impact of our decision is if we aren't going to offer any further temporary accommodation, and we'd always work with and pull on other agencies to help us make that decision.
Thank you.
Was that okay, Maria? Lovely. Cal?
Thank you. So I think most of my questions were answered during the briefing. I've got one supplementary that's occurred to me since. Section 4.25 talks about a requirement for the council to notify other local authorities if we're placing out of area. Does that happen in reverse? Obviously, in theory it should, but do other local authorities place in Portsmouth for temporary accommodation?
It's difficult to answer that question completely because we have so few notifications that would lead me to think other councils aren't placing them. So it's hard for me to know if they are, but we don't get many notifications at all from other local authorities.
Was that it, Cal?
Yes, my question.
Okay, thank you. Just following on from that, Cal, I certainly know that before the Homeless Reduction Act was introduced, there were certainly authorities outside of Portsmouth who were placing people here, not necessarily homeless people, but placing people here. You're right to raise it is a problem that's occurring across the country, particularly with authorities in London who seem to be placing them in Birmingham or York or miles away from home. I think one of the joys that we want to do moving forwards is to minimise that for our city, but what they often will do is they'll enter into arrangements with private landlords. Previously I got to hear about it and I managed to stop it. But you're right to raise the issue. Good afternoon, young Scott. But thank you for that question because I think it is pertinent for many councils across the country. So for the hundreds of thousands watching on the live stream, Councillor Scott Pater Harris, the Conservative spokesman on housing, has arrived. Thank you, Chair. And we have indulged him to the extent of we're doing the private rented. Well, now you're here, we might do the private rented sector next. Depending on how
Thank you.
Before I sum up on this, well, as you're here now, we're doing the temporary accommodation placement policy. Did you have any questions or comments on that?
No, I think we ironed that out in full council.
Yes, we did, for about 3 hours, which is absolutely fine. Hang on. And do you have anything interesting to declare that's relevant to this meeting?
No, not
Okay.
really.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll do some summing up, if I may. I'm happy to agree to all the recommendations in here. Temporary accommodation is something that we took on as an administration when we came in May 2018, and we've spent a bit of time working out exactly what the issues are and exactly what to do. I may rehash some of the stuff I said in Council last week, and apologies for that. The problem is increasing because when government rightly brought in the Homelessness Reduction Act, it didn't give councils enough cash to deal with the demand that was coming. So although we are now housing more people in temporary accommodation, it's now 480 this year as opposed to 372 last year, so an increase of a third. There are still concerns. And one thing that concerns me is everybody not knowing where they're going. And that's why it's important that this policy in terms of placing people and the upcoming policy in terms of accommodating people and procuring temporary accommodation is important. It cannot be those seen in isolation. It's one of many things this administration is doing in order to do that, not just utilising the former Southsea Community Centre site for temporary accommodation, also buying back council properties, and there is more of that in our draft budget, which has been published this afternoon, but also this policy as well, and there is more to come, because we want to make sure that we're proactive and ambitious in terms of dealing with the issues concerned, and this is just one of those building blocks to make sure we know where we're going. So on that basis, but also taking on board Cal's point as well about how important it is to make sure that families are housed as local to where they live as possible, which is absolutely crucial, I'm happy to endorse this report. Thank you very much, colleagues. So in order to give Scott enough time to recover from what I understand was a long drive, I'm proposing that we do and thank you colleagues for coming, that's very great, thank you very much indeed. I'm proposing that we do the council budget next, if that's all right.
Yeah.
And then do the private rented sector paper last. You've got the council housing budget 2020-2021, and I understand Mr. Leighton will guide us through this.
Thank you. So the report before you has a myriad of different recommendations in it. The first one is to approve the revised budget for this current year. The next is to agree various increases or setting of charges for next year that come into effect from the 1st of April 2020, and then to agree the budget for 2020-21, and then note the forecast budgets for 21-22 and 22-23. The report then talks about the kind of financial environment that we're working in at the moment, and the big thing that has been an issue for us over the last 4 years has been the effect of the Welfare Reform Act and the fact that our rents have been decreasing every year by 1% for the last 4 years. So much so that the rental value at the moment is actually £4 million lower than when we started in 2016. And in terms of what that's actually done to our outturn, well, our reserves are actually £12 million less than they would have been had we been able to apply even just an inflationary increase to our rents over that same period. I also talk about the issue with the borrowing cap. So last October 2018, obviously the borrowing cap was removed. What we've seen since then is we've started to build properties, basically at Albion House and Doyle Avenue, Brendonbury, and there's some others in Train. That should hopefully have it will have a positive effect on our finances going forward. But the effect of that is obviously based on the extent in which we use that borrowing power. So into the proposed charges for next year. So the council, the rent standard said that we were allowed to increase rent by a maximum of CPI plus 1%. So the CPI reference date is in September 2019, and that was 1.7%. So with 1% added on to that, we're proposing to increase rents by 2.7%. This is based on the fact that obviously when you look at the forecast going forward, I think the council has no other choice at this point but to try and increase the amount of income that it can get in order to meet the services and maintain the standards we've currently got within the HRA. General service charges, again, are increasing largely in line with inflation. So if you live in a house, last year it would have cost you £6.16. This year it will be £6.30 a week, and similarly in a flat that's gone up by 28 pence a week. Sheltered housing charges, again, increased just above inflation, and that's partly due to the fact of the service that's provided and the number of properties. So effectively, the less properties that there are, or active tenancies there are, then the smaller the number there is to divide the entire cost of providing the service. And there's also the issue with the reliance on agency staff in order to be able to run the service itself. Laundry charges, last year they were increased for washers by 50p. This year we're not proposing to increase that charge at all or to change it, because we now feel that the amount that we're collecting is enough to meet the cost of the service. Similarly, heating charges, we're not proposing any increase this year, and that's partly due to the fact of the buying power of the City Council and the way we've been able to forward purchase our energy supply, so we've got surety over the next year, so we don't need to increase those. Garage and parking sites generally are being increased by 1.7%, which is the CPI value at September, except for where people are non-domiciliary in that area. So those that use these parking spaces like for commuting or as additional storage in the cases of garages, and they're not living in that area, then their charge will go up 5%, and part of that is to bring it up into line with how much it would cost you if you were to use other forms of parking within the City Council. The budget for next year, we are forecasting that we will have a £1.2 million deficit in year. Part of the cost of that will be met from the specific housing revenue and ring-fence reserve. And when you look at the forecast budget, you'll see that deficit increases over the next couple of years as well, and will continue to do so unless positive actions taken by the council. But at the moment, this report's saying that we're within our sort of statutory guidelines in the fact that we're able to meet the cost of the service by using our reserves. But obviously, that's not tenable in perpetuity. During this process, we have conducting some consultation with our residents. We attended a session in the Charles Dickens Activity Centre back in late November. We've then been to CLG on November and December, and then again in January. Unfortunately, due to the general election in Purda, I think January was the first time members were able to attend any of those sessions. But we obviously, I think Cal attended the one in January, and I think others have been briefed. And that is it. Has anyone got any questions?
Okay. I will again start with Pete. Do you have any questions? Blimey. Okay. Right. Okay. Right. Maria.
Because we've had so much consultation, I think any little niggles were ironed out with Wayne anyway at those meetings. So I don't have anything specific apart from 4.2. It is not residents' development, it's residents' engagement. Development is going back a couple of years. It's just a technical issue.
Okay.
I think that point has been duly noted and the naughty step has been turned on to, so that's fine. Anything else, Mum? No, right. Cal?
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions and some more general comments, if that's okay.
Yeah, Cal.
Parking charges, are they set at a level to break even with the costs associated with maintenance and repairs specifically of those car parks, or do they potentially surplus producing?
Right, okay. So the answer is no, they're not. I think they were once upon a time, and I think during the consultation, what it became apparent was it was one of the things we actually changed, because the amount that we were increasing charges before had been kind of linked to our demand within that specific area. And I think over the years that's happened, and I think we've moved away from just the specific cost of maintenance. So there aren't enough spaces for every single person who lives in that area to have a parking space. So it's linked to demand. It's almost like an extra service. Not everyone's getting it. So there has to be some form of nominal charge. And I think from the consultation we had, and it was quite an area of debate actually about how those charges were set. I think next year we're going to be looking at this again in more detail about how we make it and how whether the charge is right or not, and whether everyone because you see regionally around the city and indeed outside of the city, there's quite a change.
The second question, in terms of the higher affordable rent levels that are charged, will the proposed rent increase potentially take any of those above the LHA rate?
No, they won't.
Okay, thank you. So I've just got a couple of general
Yeah,
comments.
please,
if that's okay to
fire
make.
away, Cal.
So I've been doing the rounds of kind of community meetings in the ward, residents meetings and all the rest of it, and trying to engage people with this. I know there was quite a low response rate to the initial consultations. I've been trying to get out there and do what I can to drive that up. The general feedback that I've got is that people feel that rents in the whole are reasonable, so they understand the kind of small increase in the rents. The main concerns that I have received kind of over the term since I've been elected last year is around parking charges. And the way in which they're set and the way in which they relate to other parking in the area. So I'll give the example that most people have contacted me about, and that is the Somerstown area of Charles Dickens Ward. So you've got various different types of parking available. You've got, for the people that live in the council blocks on Hyde Park Road, they can buy a permit for the parking on Hyde Park Road, which they sell just about as many permits as there are, so they've reasonably chance of getting a space, £30 a year. People that live the next council block along, just around the corner, Ladywood House, they've got a block there just for people that live in Ladywood House. It's the only people who can buy permits there. It's not on the street, it's a council housing owned block. Their parking permits are £50. And then come a bit further along, you've now got all the parking around Wilmcote House, now Somerville Court, Ivy Close, where the charges are over £200 a year, because they're individual spaces that are rented out space by space. And it's that renting out space by space. I know there are advantages for residents in terms of having a guaranteed space and not having to drive around in it for them and all the rest of it. But that £200 can become quite a significant fee, particularly if, again, the people that have contacted me, a number of individual cases not related to one another, people on 0-hour contracts, working in care or other forms of precarious employment, dependent on their car for work, so it's not an option for them not to have one if they want to work, but they do find that that kind of £200 a year fee is on the high side, particularly when they look at the car park in Ladywood and the on-street parking in Hyde Park Road, which is obviously quite significantly higher than those. So just something I said I would flag and make people aware of. I think more generally in terms of council rents, and again this is probably product of national government policy, but we've now almost got a two-tier level of rent setting. So you've got the social rents, which I think the figures kind of reported on here, but my understanding is now that a lot, if not all, new council development tend to be set at the affordable rent levels, which are quite significantly higher. So again, maybe it's not anything that we could do anything about today, but it's really to kind of flag the issue that we're kind of almost ghosting into this situation where within PCC council housing we've got this two-tier level of social rents and then quite a lot more expensive affordable rents. The agency staff, because I understand one of the points in here in regards to supported housing is an additional cost or an increased cost relating to agency staff in supported housing. Maybe just to flag that, I know we did discuss it in a briefing, but to flag it again, I come from a background of working in supported housing in the voluntary sector. We very rarely, if ever, had to use agency staff. The charity that I worked for had a bank of relief staff who were available to come and fill in the odd shift here and there, and they were then obviously paid the normal rate, which was a lot less than standard council rates and not taking into account terms and conditions and pensions and all the rest of it. So if it's possible to do in the voluntary sector, maybe that's something that we can have a look at ourselves. And yeah, that was all I want to say. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Cal. If I may come back to a couple of points that you raised when I do some summing up. But did any officers have any initial responses to any of that? If not, that's absolutely fine. No. Just also for the record, Cal has just mentioned the council block my mum lives in, which doesn't affect what I do, but I have to declare it because in the interest of openness and transparency, it's what they call a personal but not a prejudicial interest, and she doesn't have a car, so therefore she doesn't apply to that. Right, Scott.
Thank you, Councillor Sanders. Wayne, can you just clarify, did you say to me the deficit is rising year on year? Projection. Have I got that right? Or if I've got it wrong, just tell me.
Yep, as in Appendix 3, yeah.
As in Appendix 3, the deficit is rising. Okay. Yep. That's interesting. Okay, stick with Appendix 3 actually, Wayne, while we're here, because I did ask you about a few things in the briefings. Youth clubs, I just want to know what the difference between the outturn and the actual forecast is, because it's showing a projection of a drop in the draft budget for the following year. What is that? Because it's only about a 22 grand drop compared to the actual forecast.
Yeah, sorry, I've got it in front of me. I'm just trying to remind myself again.
No, that's community warden, sorry, yeah, 22,000.
Yeah, so...
We'll do it line by line.
The specifics around the youth clubs is we've got an additional 15,000 that we've, in grant funding, we've secured from the Police and Crime Commissioner to part fund Stamshore youth provision.
Is that the, Wayne, just sorry, is that for holiday provision? I think if I remember, like, when I went down and seen what's actually going on there. I don't know if James can probably clarify what it actually is. What is that noise?
I have no idea. It's certainly not. Certainly not my phone.
Your mic's on that.
It might be something. It's not my phone. My phone's there, and it's all right.
Okay. My phone's in my pocket. So
try it again. No, I think I'm aware of the 15,000. You'll carry on, Wayne.
Yeah. And then the reason why it's fallen is that this Appendix 3 forecast for 1920 is based on a forecast that we did back in September. What we've since subsequently found is we had staff who were funded in the forecast budget who are actually should have been in community centres.
Right. Okay.
So it's a mathematical error. Effectively.
So youth clubs funding should have been in community centres.
Some of it.
Why is community centres £69,000 down?
Okay, so this year we've had increased income because we've reviewed the charges that we apply in community centres. There's also in the expenditure...
Can I just say, on the increased income, does that mean we've raised our fees basically to community centres?
I think we're charging
more. Yes, we have.
Time.
We have raised our fees.
Yeah.
That's probably the nicest way of putting it.
No, I think we're more. Go on, you answer.
It's a combination of applying consistent fee charges across all the centres.
God, that is such a political answer. You should be on this side.
But genuinely, because as the centres come into the HRA, they come from associations, so they have their own charging. So we've put a consistent charging, and also we've focused the centres on their purpose, which is to generate income through hiring. So
I would be proud of that one, James.
Paulsgrove Community Centre, Cosham, really good examples where they've got more of the community using the centres and are hiring out space. So generally there's a consistency in fees and also generating income.
Sorry, just to finish off on community centres as well, this year we had a additional £50,000 water bill for a burst water main.
Where was that?
Ballsgrove.
Burst water main, okay.
So that's kind of skewed our outturn for this year.
Excuse your outturn. What about grounds maintenance and open spaces? Because that's about 55, 50, just...
Okay.
55,000.
Yeah, again, what we've got is there, in terms of the forecasting, included in there, we had cleaners and craft gardeners who shouldn't have been included within that.
So where would they should have been?
They should be included within the cleaning budget.
Okay. What else have I got left here that I've picked out? Oh, pest eradication.
Sorry?
Pest eradication, that's another one. Forecast is not in line with the actual budget outturn. About 16,000.
It's all right, I have got something here, sorry. Yeah, so effectively it's demand-led, and we set a budget, but...
So you're saying we've got less rats?
Well, we don't know how many rats we're going to have, so...
Okay. And what about community wardens? Because that's a contentious issue, because there's 22,000, I think it's, £22,000 is shown on the difference there. But obviously community wardens comes from a different portfolio, but yet it's funded through the HRA at the same time. I think 8 of the wardens are funded through the HRA.
So we've in the last year the council's doubled the number of community wardens it's got, and it's actually funded through 3 separate parts.
Yeah.
So it's funded out of the Community Safety Fund, which is a specific portfolio. Correct. The second one is the Housing Revenue Account, and the third one is a government homeless grant.
Exactly.
Now, by funding it out the HRA, that means that they can go in and deal with one of the issues that many people, particularly in Buckland, have raised with us, which is rough sleepers using the communal staircases there. So I think that's a reasonable use of money.
I don't totally agree with you, Councillor Sanders. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that the outturn is showing a 22 grand drop. So I think where it was at the time is probably a good thing, but where it could be potentially is £22,000 is a lot of money from one service. Where's it going? Are we going to have a slightly reduced service, or is it going to be paid for by someone else?
Well, I certainly don't want a reduced service because I think it's wrong to have one. But again, as we've heard from Mr. Layton across a range of things, in-year demands can change. I mean, we can't budget for a burst water main in Ballsgrove.
Very rare that
and even we can't even budget for more rats. I mean, rat forecasting, I think, is something that we're going to have to add to our list of things to do.
Absolutely.
But I don't know whether Wayne or James have got any further explanations of this.
Just on the community wardens, if we can come back with an answer on the difference as Councillor Peter Harris has outlined, but just for assurance, there is no change in the funding model or the service model. So
there's no change to community wardens moving forward?
No.
So any councillor that says there is telling lies?
There's no change in terms of the HRA's contribution. So the 8 additional community wardens funded through the 3 funding streams. So what I'm saying is that we're not sure this side as to why there's a difference with the 22,000. So
That's fine, James. I can
come back to you on that.
I'll quite happily just drop it into an email.
Okay,
it's fine.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Also, sorry, if you're trying to get in.
Apologies. Hang on, no, he is actually, but I think
might be helpful to.
Yeah, okay. Young Cal.
At tomorrow's community safety briefing or decision-making meeting, there's a report going to it about community wardens and their future funding. So it details it now. It doesn't explain the discrepancy here, but it explains how it's going to be funded for next year and what the service provisions.
While we're here, because you've obviously read that report, can you tell me if the funding's changing?
As far as I know, it's a continuation of the current model for another year.
For another year?
To then be reviewed, after that year.
Okay, brilliant. That's fine.
And Scott, that's my understanding as well. But obviously there is a minor discrepancy here which needs to get
That's what
fixed.
really does perplex me, because I'm understanding that nothing's changing, but yet the money isn't heading in the right place.
And I think we're going to get answers on that, but certainly I've made it very clear that we have to continue with this service, and I think the portmanteau funding model actually does work because it enables people to access places they might not otherwise go. and so helps to meet the demand.
Yeah, I think the description you've given about the communal areas was something that actually I think we discussed back last year.
It's one of the reasons why, sorry, I shouldn't interrupt you, Scott.
No, I was just saying it's one of the big issues that I remember we discussed, and it was something that you were definitely looking at pursuing. So I'm quite glad that it is going to be maintained moving forwards. I've got no real issues other than those things that I've picked out. So if anyone else wants to have a go, more than welcome.
Does anyone else want to have a go aside from doing RAP forecasting, which we're going to have to include?
Can I just say
year?
as well, there is a session, a line-by-line review, which is primarily for residents on the 23rd of February, which I believe is going to be in the Somerstown hub, and obviously extend the invitation to anyone who wants to come along to that.
It's honestly fine. I've got a briefing with James next week. I'm sure we'll go through it line by line.
And also, colleagues, if I could be copied into the response to Councillor Peter Harris with regards to the 22 grand discrepancy, so if necessary I can find out. I think the only thing I would say, if anybody's talking about changing it, it'll be increasing it, to be honest, because we all know the issues around the police across the city. So is that all right with you, Scott? Okay, fine, so now it's metering, if that's okay. So just to come back to a couple of points that have been raised. With regards to points around agency use, so as you may know, that there is a pilot around a block in the city in which we're looking to see if we can improve the range of care to try and cut the use of agency work. And that's something we as an administration are very interested in going forwards, partly because we're very aware of our desire to work with Unison's Ethical Care Charter, which is council policy, and work that way. So I think that's one of the things that will be pursued. In as far as rents people can afford, no one goes into, I've certainly been told, no one goes in, and I don't want people to go into a property that they can't afford. It's as simple as that. We do have a significant number of people who are on the local housing allowance level, which is very close to what is called the so-called affordable level. But I also accept that many people just can't afford that. And that's one of the reasons why at various properties, and I know my colleague Gerald Vernon Jackson has been very clear about this on some developments in the city, we're talking to people to maximise the amount of social rent properties. However, it is also clear that the rents in those social rent properties are artificially low due to 4 years of government cuts, which has led to a £12 million deficit, which is the reason we're here, and the main reason why action will be taken to deal with the deficit next year and possibly in subsequent years. And that's because we've taken the view that we do need to tackle the long-term situations that we face ourselves with, and that's one of the reasons why we're putting proposals to increase rents are being put forwards. And I would say that the £12 million deficit, government-imposed deficit that we face, which has led to problems with the reserves and has caused the position, is £12 million less we're spent on doing up properties and making people's lives better. And it's as simple as that. And that's not a position I like, and I don't think anyone living in a council property would like. And that's why we're keen on taking action to do that. With regards to the parking, I think that there is a situation, as Mr. Layton has said, I think there's a situation about looking at it going forwards. I'm certainly keen on greater integration with existing parking schemes. The Hyde Park Road one is one such thing. And I think that I've certainly asked officers to work with people in traffic and transport to facilitate that integration. I have an estate in my own ward, which is partly run by whose roads are partly run by a housing association, partly run by traffic and transport, and partly run by the council's housing department. And that is nuts. And so what we're doing as ward councillors, myself and Councillor Stagg are working together to actually come up with an integrated solution. It requires the housing association to play ball, and they've said they will verbally, and I hope that's carried through. But you're right, Cal, we have some complete nightmares, logistical nightmares in the city, and people don't care because all they want to do is have an integrated situation. And that's what I hope we will continue to do in the next year. So nobody likes putting up rents, but we have faced an artificial cut which has harmed our ability to do up and maintain our properties in this city. This package, with the proviso that we're going to be talking about parking in a more integrated manner, represents a reasonable compromise with regards to that. I'm delighted that the heating charges haven't gone up. because I know previously many people have complained about that, quite rightly. But this is a reasonable compromise in order to make sure that we can begin to rectify the deficit that has been forced on us, and that we can act on that in future. So on that basis, I'm happy to approve the recommendations and the budget as it stands. And thank you very much, colleagues, for that. So the final bit of this is the private sector helping people secure a private rented home to reduce homelessness and housing need in Portsmouth, otherwise known as expanding the rent deposit scheme. I'm not quite sure who is down to speak to it. Mr. Sage is putting himself forward, and so Mr. Sage, if you're still wishing to put yourself forward, if not, say so, forever hold your peace, please opine.
Thank you, Councillor Sanders. So the purpose of the report is to provide detailed options outlining how the council could expand the financial assistance that's available to residents to access private rented sector housing. The report gives background that highlights the importance of the private rented sector in the city. It represents more than a fifth of homes in Portsmouth, but it also identifies the level of housing need in the city, some of which we know about and some of which the City Council doesn't currently have the full data on. The report also discusses the various financial barriers that people face when trying to access the private rented sector. So that includes rents rising faster than incomes, a lack of homes available at rents below the local housing allowance cap, the potential lack of security that comes with 6-month tenancies and the additional costs of having to move if a tenancy ends before the tenant wants it to. There are income and credit checks applied by some landlords and letting agencies, which can also mean that people are required to provide a guarantor in order to secure a tenancy. And then there are the upfront costs of paying deposits and rent in advance. So the proposals outlined here specifically relate to the upfront costs and the requirements needed to access a tenancy. They don't and they can't address those ongoing affordability or supply issues. So the council currently helps people under 2 specific schemes in terms of accessing the private rented sector. So we've got a homelessness prevention fund, and we also use discretionary housing payments. Not everyone is eligible to access either of those sources of funding, so the homelessness prevention assistance is only for people who are homeless or threatened with homelessness, and there are budget constraints around the level of funding we have for that. And discretionary housing payments are only available to people that are currently receiving housing benefit or universal credit housing costs element, and are also considered to have a need to move to more suitable housing, which is usually due to affordability issues. So the council's current help for people to access private rented sector homes is constrained by finances, service criteria and operational capacity. So to help more people to access private rented sector homes, we've outlined 5 potential options. The first is the council acting as a tenancy guarantor. The second is widening the current bond scheme. Thirdly, providing guaranteed rent payments to landlords on behalf of private sector tenants. The fourth option is a deposit and rent in advance loan scheme, and the fifth option is funding an external guarantor scheme. So there's more details about all of the schemes laid out in Appendix 2. There's quite a lot of detail there. The report also outlines the potential scope of the scheme. So that is a question of whether if further support is to be provided, should it be just to those owed a duty under the Homelessness Reduction Act, so that it extends the types of help that are available, but not the number of people who can get assistance from the council, or should it be opened up to people seeking a move to the private rented sector, either because they're threatened with homelessness, or they're currently in unsuitable housing, or perhaps they're in social housing and want to move into the private rented sector. So officers are recommending a 12-month pilot of options 2 and 4. So those would be extending the bond scheme, which will enable us to develop more working relationships with private rented sector landlords in the city, which will work alongside our work around Rent It Right and our homelessness prevention work. Although with the bond scheme there is a financial risk if tenancies fail, The level of that risk is capped, so the council will only be exposed to a limited level of risk. And it will also mean that we'll be involved at an early stage if there are rent arrears or if there are other problems with the tenancies, so that we can offer support and help before the problem escalates too far. And that will also help to mitigate the risk to the council. The rent deposit loan scheme enables us to leverage additional lending by a community bank by providing some funds to protect the bank against default. That also enables the community bank to loan to people who can afford to repay the loan. Loans would only be made to people that could afford them, but people who would perhaps be considered a higher credit risk by other high street lenders and would therefore usually only be able to access loans at a much higher rate of interest. And working with the community bank also has other benefits. Community banks are ethical lenders. They promote financial capability and financial inclusion. They encourage people to save, unlike other lenders who may be more keen for people to stay in a cycle of debt. And again, they offer early help and advice for anybody who does fall behind on a loan repayment. So we provided in Appendix 2 some details of the staffing resource and the financial costs and potential risks of the schemes, but we don't have a full understanding yet of the potential demand for those schemes, and that obviously will impact on the true costs. Again, we're also developing our links with private rented sector landlords through Rent It Right and through other avenues, but we know already that our current offer of a very limited bond scheme doesn't work for landlords because it doesn't provide them with enough security against potential risks. So in extending the bond scheme and delivering that as a pilot scheme, we can learn more about the demand, about the private rented sector market, and what we can achieve with the resources made available. And obviously, as we learn more about the needs that are there, about how we can meet those needs, we can feed back on the outcomes of the pilot scheme to Housing Cabinet, and that's also stated in the recommendations for the report. So that was everything in terms of introducing it, but obviously happy to answer any questions that people may have.
Thank you, Mr. Sage. I'll start with our CLG colleagues. Welcome, madam. Thank you very much for coming. Do either of you have any comments on this particular report that we've got?
Well, I agree with
Sorry, thank you, Mark. I should have done that. We said at the start, please use your microphones.
Yeah, it really needs to have the people, those who are facing deaths or whatever, homelessness like that. But I know it's nice to help them, but in my own opinion, I hope you won't disagree with this. I hope you won't feel like, because sometimes if the people knows there is help coming, they depend on it and they will not work hard or do something to make their living better and just depend on all the help. So I think it needs to help them also to get a job or like a workshop that we will offer them so that they will find a job when they learn already, and it will help instead of giving them debts and debts. And then if they cannot pay, they will just more be in debt, buried into debts.
That's okay. Thank you very much for that. Pete?
Yeah, most of the report really answers its own questions, you know what I mean? So, there's not much more you can actually do on that one.
If they answer the questions you've got, that's also helpful, but if they don't. No?
No.
You okay? Thank you for that, Pete. Please now turn both of your microphones off. I'm very grateful. Maria?
Sorry, Chair. I've got the usual bits of paper. And
no, we like bits of paper, that's fine.
Mark has actually answered a couple of my questions, but I'll probably still say them because they're written. Right. On section 2.5, I just wondered if there would be any impact on the HRA when you're looking for the source of funding to help with this. Do you want me to go through all of them, or do you want to answer them all individually?
Mark, I can actually answer that. No.
Right. Brilliant. That's great. 3.6. I've got to reread it. Right, you've only got an approximate number of landlords. Do you know when you're going to have an actual number of landlords available?
So I don't think that there is any data on who owns all of the homes in Portsmouth, so I don't think there will ever be an exact number of the landlords that own a home in Portsmouth, and of course it does, it changes all the time with homes being bought and sold. So I think we'll only, in terms of just understanding the number of people who might be renting out a home in Portsmouth, I think all we know is that there are a lot, potentially, so there'll be some letting agencies, some larger landlords, but then lots of other people that we could potentially...
Thank you, Mark. Mr. Fielding?
Yeah, sorry, just to add to that, we work closely with the Portsmouth and District Private Landlords Association, and it was a question that I asked them, and they gave us a number, but they also said, but they're not sure either. So it's very difficult to pin down exactly how many landlords there are that are involved with letting properties in the city.
And Maria, the truth is that affects many, many councils across the country. So we have various councils who pursue policies without knowing how many people they're going to affect, which means they then in turn have to hire loads of people in order to implement the policies, which means having to spend more money than they would have done if they'd have done the work in the first place. We've recently secured, this council's recently secured a grant to try and do some of that modelling, so that we can actually have policies that reflect where the numbers are and what the situation lies and what the demand is, rather than put your finger in the wind, which seems to be what many councils perfectly understandably do. So it's a very fair point, Maria, and thank you for that.
And that continues on the same point. We've got a national average of 1.8 properties. Do we know actually how many properties we are? How many landlords have how many properties?
Yeah, again, and I'm afraid not, Maria. That was the best data that I could come up with to kind of paint that picture. There isn't anything that I could find locally that would tell us.
So the licensing doesn't tell you how many properties people have?
Licensing is not mandatory for most private sector landlords. It's only for specific types of homes. So,
and Maria, I'm tempted to do what Scott asked James was doing earlier, which is to give you a politician's answer, which is the answer I gave you some seconds ago, which again is one of the reasons that we're working in on this, because we actually want to make sure that, interestingly, it's some of the people who have extensive licensing schemes, some of the councils who have it, who actually tell it, who actually say to government and say to the House of Commons, look, we actually didn't know, so we have to hire more and more people to give more and more as more and more properties come in. And so it's a bit of a moving feast. So we'd much rather be a bit honest and get money to try and find out, rather than say, well, of course we know, which would be lying to you, and that's not fair.
Point 413. Have I understood things correctly that now landlords can no longer withhold deposits put down when the end of a tenancy happens?
So all private sector landlords have to use a deposit protection scheme. So there is a third-party independent government-backed agency that is involved at the point of the end of a tenancy. So if a landlord wants to withhold part of a tenancy, the tenant has an opportunity to dispute that, and the funds won't be released to the landlord until the deposit protections service is satisfied that the funds actually are liable to be paid. So there is much more protection, and that is a legal duty for all private sector landlords to use that.
Thank you. Next one, 6.2.2, discretionary housing payments. Have we had our notification yet of the funding? Because it does say it's coming in the end of January, and it is the end of January.
It may be actually the very last day of January. That's when.
Oh, Brexit.
So I perhaps should have put that. That is the date that the specifics around the DWP does release some data on that day. I haven't seen it yet, so unless anybody else can tell me it's been released, I don't think it's been released yet, but soon.
And I have to say, Maria, from a political side, I'm working on the basis of the 11th of March, which is the same day as the budget, so therefore any improvement on that is an improvement.
Right, thank you. Right, the next one was 10.5, 10.6. I think, Mark, you've just said that this pilot's going to last about 12 months. When does it start?
We would be looking to launch a scheme as soon as possible. So as soon as funding is approved, then we would be looking to launch from, I think, the 1st of March. We would be looking to certainly get things off the ground.
Does anyone else have any clarification or further development to that on what Mark was saying? Hang on. I'll do Paul and then James. In that order as Paul was first.
Just to confirm what Mark was saying, we are having conversations with a potential provider for the loans in option 4, and we're moving at pace to try and get the scheme set up to start as quickly as possible, but we haven't ironed out all the details yet. But as Mark said, we're hoping for early March to be a start for that one. The bond scheme, that's more something that we'd run internal, so that would be probably looking at a similar sort of timescale.
That's fine. James, do you have anything to add to that? No. Okay.
Going on then into the appendixes, item 3.2 under option 3, the council will sign an agreement to pay the monthly rent. How would that be affected by people receiving universal credit, which can be some weeks in arrears?
Yeah, so these schemes that some other local authorities are operating, the council pays the rent out of its own funds and then collects the rent back from the tenant. So the tenant would still be liable to pay the rent, but to the local authority, and the local authority would look to collect the rent on the date that it was due. And obviously for people on universal credit, that will generally be once a month, depending on their particular payment cycle. So it would be very much, as the council collects rent from our own tenants, to be working with tenants to set up payment dates that fit in with their rent account and that work with when their money comes in.
Thank you. Then on option 4.4.1, I can't find it now, but personal experience of Community Bank was credit union. They did require me, before I could take out a loan, to actually have a savings account. So is that going to apply to people who are going to be looking for help with their rents?
Yes, potentially it could. Community banks do like to promote saving, but that depends. I mean, that could just be £1 to open an account. So those are the things that would have to be decided in terms of the scheme. But yes, I mean, I think a community bank generally requires you to be a member, so in order to take out.
Right. And you'll be pleased to know, Chair, my last comment rather than question. All the options carry risk to the council, and as a local resident, I don't feel qualified to comment properly on these. So other than to say, I would trust to the Director of Finance, Councillor Sanders, and all the officers involved to make the right decision on which option to take. That's it for me.
Well, thank you for that vote of confidence, I think that was there, Maria. That's very, very kind of you, very humbling as well. That's very great. Cal?
So just one question and then a couple of comments. In terms of option 4, I think it is, which works in conjunction with the community bank to offer low-cost loans, I think we discussed the community bank that maybe haven't been approached about this. Have we got any idea of how that is going to work in practice for the people that are applying for those loans? Is it a case of do they have to physically attend the premises? And if so, my understanding is they've recently reduced their opening hours and may only be open kind of, I think, 3 days a week now. So would that potentially be impacted, particularly when people find somewhere in the private rented sector and they maybe need to move quite quickly to secure it?
Mr. Fielding.
Sorry, this may sound like another political answer, but we're still working through the details at the moment, so we haven't agreed anything in terms of that detail. So we've just literally, pending this decision, having initial discussions. So the whole how the scheme will run hasn't been decided, but will be done so over the next few weeks, and we'll obviously provide information when we've done that. But we haven't gone down to that level of detail yet.
Sorry to interrupt you, Cal. I would say though that actually that is one of the key bits that if this option is to be pursued, that is one of the key bits that we need to sort out, which is because it's three mornings a week, I think it is, up on Fratton Road. And so I'm sure I'm pretty confident that this organisation with a very large revenues and benefits group and a dedicated rooms and offices can work it out. But I would suggest that is explored as one of the options.
Yeah,
Sorry, not even an option, as one of the conclusions
No,
of the discussion.
I don't foresee any problems, because the sorts of people that we'd be dealing with if we went down that option 4 route would be coming in to talk to us anyway, so through the Housing Needs Advice and Support team probably. So we'd be making sure we've got lots of connection with those people. I don't foresee that being an issue.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you, Cal.
So I think, as the report highlights, there's I think the issues in the private rented sector can be split primarily into 3 groups: affordability, standards and access. On affordability, I suspect our hands are somewhat tied in what we can do as a local authority. It's only going to be within the remit of national government potentially change the rules around giving local authorities the power to control rents and maybe reduce or give them powers to put limits on the increases that they can put in place. In terms of standards, that is obviously something that's very much within the council's remit, and I know that a lot of work does go on around that. I'm still very interested in the idea of extending licensing of private landlords, and I know there's ongoing work from that, and hopefully we'll see the results of that survey soon. So that leaves the third part, access, which is what we're here to talk about today. I think generally the scheme should be welcomed if it can increase access to private rented sector in any way. It seems to me there's lots of potential benefits of helping people move into appropriate accommodation that are currently housed either with friends or family, or an accommodation that is too small for them, and that could also potentially reduce pressure on the waiting list going forward. If maybe people that are overcrowded and would go on their waiting list, or can then be removed if they're able to access the private rented sector in that way. And I know just from a casework perspective, from people I know, access to the private rented sector is one of the major barriers to people getting the housing that they need. The fact that guarantors are required and people with poor credit are often excluded. So if those schemes can address that, then I generally think it's a sensible idea to pilot and then review as we go forward.
Thank you for that, Cal. Scott.
Thank you, Councillor Sanders. I'm going to sound a little bit disingenuous, Mark, I'm sorry, so please apologise. I apologise in advance. From 3.1 down to about 3.7, there's lots of information there, in data, so to speak, but it doesn't tell me a great deal. If anything, it murks the water a little bit in terms of we don't actually know how many landlords we've got, so we've gone for a national average. We have no data regarding the economic status of approximately 10,000 PRS households. So it just looks a bit, from a perspective of reading it, just doesn't read very well, and that's not a criticism of you. I think me, when I'm reading it and looking at the data, I'm feeling a bit like, do we know what we're doing here? Do we ever got the right amount of data? Is there anything else you think you could have done differently to actually find that data, or is that literally all we've got to go on?
Yeah, I think, as I say, as things stand, this is the best data that we've got available to us. I mean, summarised, it's not trying to encompass everything that the council knows around housing in the city, but the key parts in relation to this. But the report is recommending a pilot, and part of that is about learning more about the need that's out there and about the housing market. So I think those two things go together. Yeah, I think in there what I'm trying to say is what we do know and what we don't know, because it's useful just to flag up things that people might assume are widely known or easy for the council to find out and actually aren't necessary.
I have to admit, I mean, reading it, it does come across as a bit of like, we know about this, but we don't know about that. So I sort of get where you're coming from, and it's not a criticism, it's just how it's, basically we're working with what we've got, so I appreciate that. I just want to move on down to actually where we are moving forward in terms of the scope. There's scope 1 and scope 2. Are we in any sort of idea what scope we're going to go with? We're going to go with scope 1, where it's more narrow. We're going to go for scope 2, where it makes the field slightly bigger. I look at you.
Well, you can look at me all you like. I'm actually going to wait until the end of this discussion. I think that's.
Just want to know.
I'll come back to that in my summing up comments, because I think that's actually been one of the issues affecting a lot of the questions that have been going on.
There is a bit of a reason I ask, because obviously scope 2 it has a significantly larger, basically, pool to play with. So the cost implication could be slightly higher. And I ask that question because where we're going to go for a pilot scheme from what it, as it reads, and from our discussions previously, I believe it was the Leaders Portfolio Reserve, where the...
I will come back to that in a bit.
See, I asked the question because I have concerns that a sum of money is going to be set aside and that sum of money could either be vastly spent or could vastly not be spent. So I just want to get clarity of what that number is when we move forward. Also, the fact that it is a pilot scheme, we should... Do you want to jump in?
I'm just a great believer in you. Please continue, and then people can reply. So I don't want to interrupt you. I am interrupting.
I don't know, what did I get up to?
I think you got up to... Where's the money coming from?
Oh yeah, pilot scheme, that was it. Right on, thank you, Cal. Talking about the pilot scheme, and if this pilot scheme does go forward, can we have a commitment from yourself to review in 3 months to see where we're going, see how it is looking? I asked you that because you haven't even recommended it yet, but if you're going to recommend it, would you be willing to do that?
I will come back. I don't want to sound like a politician, but I am.
Oh, politicians answers all day.
In a few minutes.
Okay, well, I think Councillor Corkery's made some real good points about access, and I do actually agree with vast amounts of it. However, reading the comments from the City Solicitor, in which he does state that this is, there we go, he's quite actually measured in what he says. He says that given the obvious and high financial risk, along with the associated budgetary implication, and that theme carries on with the Directors of Finance's comments when he does actually make there is obvious certain degree of risk within what we're going to do, or plan to do, whatever Councillor Sanders decides he's going to do at the end of this meeting, which I'm pretty sure he's going to go ahead with it. But I think there needs to be some real stringent rules in place, because I have concerns that fundamentally, and the City Solicitor has put this down quite right, that we have a duty to not just one set of taxpayers, but all set of taxpayers, and I think if you're going to do this, you have to do it properly. We have to ensure that we're not wasting taxpayers' money. And I have concerns about certain of the options, because I think the options do carry significant risk. For example, I've got written down here 2.8, which comes up to about the 6 months rent. A maximum of 4 months rent for each tenant assisted under the scheme. So effectively, 8 failed tenancies at a rent of £800 a month could actually considerably put the council in a little bit of a hole. And we've already got a budget deficit of 1.2 million, as we heard earlier. So I think we have to be quite careful about going on schemes that can actually end up costing the council more money in the long term. While the benefits might actually outweigh that, I think we need to actually really be careful if the pilot does go ahead, because we need to manage the finance and see actually if we can afford to do this, we can put this much aside. But the fact of the matter is, if we can't afford it, we just can't do it, because we cannot afford to waste taxpayers' money. And I think the same goes for option 4. If you go to option 4, I mean, I found that probably more concerning in terms of you put 25 grand in contingency, which enables you to lend 100 grand, and then you're giving out 6 months rent in advance to 10 households, or loans up to £1,000 of house to 50 households, and these are people that are on lower incomes anyway. So are we actually putting more pressure on them by actually giving them a loan, to pay back in the longer term? And those unwanted pressures for people in life, I just don't think it potentially is the right thing to do. So I do have concerns, but fundamentally I think if it's done correctly, and it is brought back through this forum where we can actually review and look at it in a manner that the portfolio holder sees fit, then okay. But I do think we've got taxpayers' money at hand, and the Directors of Finance's comments and the City Solicitor's comments are worth reading, because those two, the Director of Finance, I'd be really interested to know if he's been in discussions regarding the community bank, because if he's writing down that he's got concerns about it, then he's in the room actually discussing the actual loan facility payment. I think that's a bit of a cop-out in my opinion. But then you've got the City Solicitor saying that we've got a duty to taxpayers. So I think it's worth being on the record for that, because they're the two quite important officers in the council, especially the Section 5.1 officer who has to sign this off. Effectively, has got deep concerns about it.
Mr. Layton, as the finance man, are there any particular comments about that?
So I, along with other officers, have been in the discussions with the community bank, and I think And I'll answer this as more like a housing professional than an accountant, but what we're trying to do here is not set people up to fail. So there is a process in place where the community bank will go through and they will assess whether someone is able to pay, and if they're not able to pay, they won't be offered a loan.
That's really great, Wayne, and I totally get that, and I wouldn't suspect us to do that at all. But what I'm saying is some people cannot help themselves. I think we have to be very mindful of that. There are certain sections of society, that we have a duty of care to, and I wouldn't want us to put anyone in a position where they could not afford to pay. And that is what concerns me, long term. Because fundamentally, they become liable, the council becomes liable, the taxpayer becomes liable. It's a vicious circle. We all suffer, and not just the person involved. So I think we've got to be very careful about widening this access pool, which I think is the right thing to do. But we have to do it in a manner where we can actually afford to do it.
Did you have any further questions, Scott? Okay, that's fine, thank you. Right, thank you very much. If I may, I'll try and run through firstly some of my thoughts around some of the questions that have been raised, because actually some of them do affect where I would like to go with this, and then offer up a few comments as well, if I may. So I want to start with Scott's points, because Scott's point, we have an Appendix 6, which is called Comparisons of Options, which outlines all the options, including additional council resources to be funded, and even on the back at page 14, which people on the online won't see, it includes things like likely cost of liability, likely cost per annum in terms of resources, and then cost per application. And to be honest, it is that page that has driven me to where I want to end up with all this, because I think that there are some options that will be highly financially unrealistic. I think wouldn't work with what we believe the issues are. A lot of what we do with people, such as if they want to go to right to buys as well, and actually looking through individual council tenants, actually assessing their finances. So a lot of that work goes on already, Scott. And you're right, sometimes there are some right to buy people who say, no, I'm going to be absolutely fine with the mortgage, and come back 6 months later and say, I'm not. And that's right to be cautious about that, but that's why I think some of the options can be discounted, because I think they do present some financial risks, and they don't help that many people either, which to me is really, really important. So, what I'm proposing to do is as follows. I'll explain why this is here, and then I'll explain what I want to do with it. So, as Cal has said, lots of us at the council get lots of people who want to rent private, or are so far down the waiting list that renting privately is the fastest way for them to get a home. And there are real barriers that face people. I speak as someone who rents privately, and I've seen some barriers for people getting there. And it's not all around the state of the properties. It's all around, most people in the city have a very good experience with private landlords. It's also around the financial problems that exist, particularly for those people who are on low incomes, particularly for the working poor, who don't have much money at the end of the week and have tended to be left behind by politicians, and I'm going to say politicians of all parties from time to time. Whilst I would love the idea of rent controls personally, the chances of that happening under this government are between 0 and none. So I think that's a reality that we have to face, and so therefore what we've got to do is to try and offer a series of incentives. The Liberal Democrats did say we were going to do this in our manifesto of 2018, and I'm delighted that after a little delay, we're able to fulfil that promise. But we have to do it sustainably, and we have to do it right. We can't, and again, this is one of the issues around the data, we can't just pile in with a scheme that won't work. And that means we've got to do it sustainably in a way that can help as many people as possible, whilst putting the council at as little financial risk as possible. But it's not alone, because it's part of the ambitious work that we're doing, because we're ambitious about dealing with the private rented sector in the city, the work we're doing about the sector as a whole, which Cal alluded to earlier on. As far as I can see, only the 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester are doing as comprehensive a set of work around the private rented sector as we are, and they've got £1.5 million from the Nationwide Foundation that's being done by Shelter. So that's because we've got to sort every little moving part out. We can't just go, as some councils have done, with one thing and then find later on that they have to employ people in order to catch up because they don't know how many people live there. Our tenants, our private sector and the people on our waiting list deserve better than that. And that's why we're going for a comprehensive approach, of which this is part. And that's why I think the pilot suggestion from officers is a very, very good one. Because it enables us to get an idea of what is going whilst actually helping people. So I want to come back to how I propose to alter the recommendations so as to accommodate people's concerns. So I want to amend recommendation 2.3. I'll explain why in a bit, but I'll read it out first. And amend it to say that the Cabinet Member for Housing agrees to the officer's recommendation to proceed with extending the bond scheme and enabling a community bank to provide low-cost, no-interest loans. That's options 2 and options 4B. That's because I'm really, really worried that if we actually use the community bank to provide interest loans, even at the low rates that exist, it's putting people into more debt because they have to pay interest. And I believe that's something the council should do in this case. The cost per application that we've seen only goes up a bit, and is still miles less than anywhere else. So I don't think that's putting us at unnecessary financial risk. The second bit of the amendment to 2.3 is the member also agrees with the officer recommendations on eligibility and to scope 2 of the report, allowing those threatened with homelessness, not currently living in suitable self-contained accommodation or seeking a move into the private rented sector to benefit. That's because we want to see what's really going on across a range of people's lives, and not purely around those at risk of homelessness, but including those too, because the administration wants to do a lot of things to help people who are in that position. But also we need to make sure it's people who are low down on our waiting list who just want a home and are worried that they can't get one because they can't afford it. So that's my first amendment. My second amendment is to 2.4, and that actually comes back to Scott's point, which is about a review, because I agree. I think a review is necessary. I think, though, that although some things you'll know if they work after 3 days, in this particular case, 3 months is far too early. I understand why, but 3 months is I'll come back. Hang on. I don't want you to read what I've written out, but I'll come back to that in a second. So in Amendment 2.4, I'm saying what I'm wanting to do is, in the last bit, which says report back on the progress of the pilot scheme to the Cabinet Member of Housing, I want to amend that to say, and to review the scheme's effectiveness and operations for future development, starting in the second quarter of the pilot to facilitate planning for the future. So that's a bit from 6 months onwards, but it's not to stop at 6 months. So it's not you start at 6 months and you end at 6 months, because that's nonsense. But it enables us to start it properly and then see what works, and then it also enables us to look at future budgets to deal with the financial sustainability of the project, and also to see, do we need to do more, or is it not going to work? It's those sorts of things, and I think to start at 6 months but then do it on an ongoing basis actually enables us to do that, and to do that properly. And I'm happy for progress reports, once we've completed that, to come back here. I suspect it will come back into various forms, because I suspect it will affect a few budgets along the way. My final alteration is to 2.5, which is to say that money for the operation and any financial liability incurred by the pilot comes from the leader's portfolio reserve, in line with the leader's constitutional obligation to tackle poverty in the city. Because this is about tackling poverty. It's a different type of poverty, because it's the poverty of aspiration, or the inability of people to get where they want to go. That has been agreed with Joanne in Democratic Services, and also with the leader as well. Just to make sure that it's all belt and braces. But the reason for that has actually affected some of the questions that have gone on, because some of the questions have been, well, how is it going? What are we doing? Where are the negotiations going? And part of that is because, frankly, we've been given options and not a decision. So I think from the decision, that will actually speed up the discussions with the community bank, with a view of starting as soon as possible. If we start on February the 29th, or I think that's a Saturday, then that would be lovely. but we need to start this as soon as possible so that we can evaluate it as soon as possible. So with those amendments, I think we're in a position whereby we can actually, for the first time, start to deal with some of the real causes stopping people renting privately in the city and being on our waiting list. It's tackling long-term problems that should have been tackled years ago. And I'm delighted that we're able to do that. So on that basis, I'm happy to move the amended recommendations, and on that basis, I'm happy to close the meeting at 5:56 p.m. Thank you very much.